Welcome to Talk Save, Culture Talks, the podcast of Paradisec, the Pacific and Regional Archive for digital sources in endangered cultures. I'm Jodie Kell.
And I'm Stephen Gagao. These are conversations with people who have personal and cultural connections to the languages and music in our archive.
Michael Webb is an ethnomusicologist specialising in Melanesian musical cultures past and present. He is an associate professor at the University of Sydney, based at the Conservatorium of Music. Michael grew up in Papua New Guinea in the 1960s and 1970s, and in the 1980s he worked there as a secondary and tertiary educator. In 1993, Michael travelled to Rabaul in Papua New Guinea for his PhD research on the history of music in the region, recording interviews and music performances on cassette tape and Super 8 video. Last year, 25 years after his visit, Michael asked Paradisec to digitise and archive his extensive collection of recordings, creating the collection MW6, accessible through the online catalogue. This podcast is the first part of 2 episodes in which we discuss this collection with Michael. In this episode, you will discover the remarkable connection between Michael's recordings and Stephen Gagao. And in the second episode, Rabaul, the music, you can hear the story unfold as the 2 friends listen to and talk about excerpts from the collection.
As you have mentioned, Jodie, this collection is not just part of my archival work, but has a direct connection to me as an indigenous man from the Gazelle Peninsula. My people are known as the Tolai or Gunantuna, and most of the recordings are about pioneers, innovators, and creative artists of my people over 4 decades in our music history. I grew up in Vivian Village in the Toma area in the hinterlands of the Gazelle Peninsula. The Gazelle Peninsula and the Duke of York Islands are part of the province of East New Britain in the northeastern tip of the island of New Britain. Currently, the capital of the province is Kokopo. However, in the time of Michael's fieldwork in 1993, Rabaul was the old capital. It was largely destroyed by the volcanic eruption in 1994. I've come a long way from Vivian Village, but my work in Sydney as an archivist has brought me back to 1993 with my people.
Welcome, Michael and Stephen. First of all, Michael, how did you meet Stephen?
Well, I'd heard about Stephen a little bit through another mutual friend of ours, Dennis Crowdy, from Macquarie Uni. And then from there, I think the time we first actually met was sort of randomly in the corridor or somewhere here at the Conservatorium. And I suddenly thought, whoa, Stephen Mas Man Tolai. I saw his face and I said, he's got to be a Tolai. And that started bringing back a lot of the memories of my time when I did my doctoral field research in Rabaul. But I was a bit nervous about talking to him about that because I instantly thought, it's been a long time since I've thought about the music in my research back in the early 90s, and he no doubt knows a lot more than me, so if I open my mouth I might make some mistakes. So it was that. But then, of course, One Talk System kicks in and very quickly, and we became friends over it just pretty quickly, and moved from acquaintances to friends in about 2 weeks. And then started talking about people we knew we mutually knew, and about music and musicians and just different things like that, and so forth. So let Stephen think about
How
it.
did you meet Michael? Like, what do you...
He's a natural tolai to me. The way is my interaction and just getting to know him. I've heard about him also through Dennis. So Dennis is a mutual friend of mine, and he keeps talking about there's a Michael in Sydney Uni who does work, in music back at home, and the conversation started, and I just naturally kind of gel with him, and personality, that kind of is the sort of thing that us,
probably started with a few jokes.
Yeah, started with a few jokes. So we've kind of become real friends now. I just thought, and working on his collections, the connection I have is because ethnically, culturally, I'm really connected to it, to the source of it, and like what Michael said about, he was thinking twice about, asking questions. I think for me it's a learning process that I begin to learn about the music from his collections, and that's where we got to talk about that, because it actually has enriched my personal knowledge and put things in perspective about music back in Rabaul and Gazelle and New Guinea Islands, for that matter.
I'd thought for a long time about bringing my collection and seeing my fieldwork recordings and seeing if Paradisiac was interested. But I think that as an ethnographer and ethnomusicologist, feel kind of vulnerable. You sort of feel like when you put a collection of a particular documenting a particular period of fieldwork down, you can see all the glaring gaps and the things that you should have done, and also once you kind of hear the kind of your interview technique, or you hear yourself bumbling through trying to find out about musical practices, you kind of go, oh, I don't really want to listen to that. But anyway.
It's interesting you say that, though, because I think our experience, I know working with Stephen and working on the digitisation of the collection, that we've actually been feeling like it has this incredible richness, and I think we've found there's a huge amount of information, don't you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. For me, it's the musical journey of the various people you interviewed actually made me part of it, because I used to wonder how, Telek came to being, or the mixed race and the Chinese community came into being, and how the music developed, evolved, and the experience alone, for me, it's really enlightening, enriching.
Okay, so that's what took me to Rabaul in the first place. Actually, my kind of lifelong ethnomusicological mentor is Don Niles at the Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies in Port Moresby. I consulted with Don about going to Rabaul to do PhD work, and after talking to him about my reasons for wanting to go there, he was very strongly encouraging. And my reasons were that the town intrigued me because of its it was the region where in the New Guinea Islands where Christianity was first introduced, and then it became a port town, so under German colonial control in the 1880s, 1882, I think, and then the town of Rabaul was built around roughly the first decade of the 20th century by Chinese labour, but under the governor Albert Hall. Then the first Australian action during World War I occurred on the Gazelle Peninsula, and I think it was 6 Australians were shot there at the beginning of World War I, and they're buried at Bitapaka. And so it was Rabaul was taken from by Australians, British/Australians from the Germans. And then there's this sort of long period through the 20s, the appropriation of the German plantations and whatnot, and the 1921 League of Nations, Australian Protectorate Agreement, and then Japanese bombed Rabaul in 1942, January 1942, and took over, and for about 3.5 years they were in control. then it was taken back by Australians, and then the Gazelle Peninsula was the site of a lot of ferment in the lead up to self-government and independence, and it's associated with several important Australian politicians as well. Gough Whitlam and John Gorton, for example, both Australian Prime Ministers visited Rabaul, and so forth. So I was intrigued by the history, and I thought this has got to be it's got to have a complicated history musically, and so that's sort of what drew me. Also, I'd heard Tolo music, and when I was working in PNG in the 80s, so I was teaching at Sogeri National High School in 1982, and that was the time when the band Panim Walk broke out, and so that was a Tolo rock band that was really kind of an early Tolo expression of rock, indigenous sort of rock sound, and it wasn't just because of Telek's voice and his singing in language and his stinging style, but because of John Warabat's guitar playing as well, which in my analysis kind of follows a little bit like Timbuk style, the xylophone playing and the Warabat, actually his name gives it away, the Warabat song style rhythm as well. Anyway, so I was drawn to the town because of the fascinating history, and it's far more complicated than I thought before I went there.
And what did you get? I know that Stephen's been really interested in finding out what your thesis, like what came out of it.
You know, you go in with a kind of plan, but my plan was really to meet musicians, older and younger, and talk first with after I've met as many musicians as I could, and to see what kind of picture might emerge in terms of trying to see what sort of narratives came out of that. So there was a gentleman who's no longer alive by the name of Ray Sheridan, who lived and worked in Rabaul from 1947. He was in what was then New Guinea during World War II, and he became fascinated with the music, and so he went back. And ended up as a sort of I think he worked as a health officer in Rabaul and in Kavieng. And from 1947, from that time he started recording, or maybe in the 1950s and 60s, he started recording the music of any indigenous groups that were resident in Rabaul. And in the early 60s he released a record on the Wattle label called Music of New Guinea, which became quite well known because it was the only one of its kind, really. He published an article in an encyclopedia on music, the Encyclopedia of Papua and New Guinea. It was a 2-volume 1970s work, and his was interesting to me because he was one of the few people. He wasn't an ethnomusicologist per se, but he was one of the first music researchers to concentrate on contemporary forms, and that intrigued me. I decided then, through the process of meeting musicians and after beginning to have conversations, I'll concentrate on Tolo music making because they were the dominant group. At the time that I was doing research, I think the Tolo people numbered around 100,000 people.
In Rabaul.
And I think it's larger than that now, much larger than that now.
Well, that 100,000 is actually mostly the Gazelle Peninsula. Not Rabaul was the township.
That's
Okay.
The area.
Yeah.
Now.
So the hinterland. Is,
the hinterlands,
So it's the biggest group.
Yeah.
So the Tolo were about were at the time that I was doing my research the third largest ethnic group in Papua New Guinea, and that also was one of the reasons I was interested. And so it became a study of what's known as the colonial century, 1875 to 1975, and 1875 being the year that George Brown landed in the Duke of York Islands and to found the Methodist Wesleyan Methodist mission there, and 1975 being the year of Papua New Guinea's independence. And so I'd concentrate on that century, and I would see if I could discover anything about ethnic identity formation of the Tolai people, but examined through the lens of music. So my idea was to look at ethnicity, and then to see if I could do that over the long term, and see what music had to say about ethnic formation. Because when George Brown first started visiting the Gazelle from the Duke of York's, which are right adjacent, the Tolai people weren't the Tolai people. In fact, the Tolai is actually a sort of a made-up name. Stephen should tell us about what Tolai means. Tolai.
Tolai. Well, and I'll just have a step back. The Tolais, well, traditionally from history, we moved over to New Britain from New Ireland. But the Tolai is more, it's like friendship, lay. We always put prefixes in front of names. So Tolai is my friend, and Tol meaning you, my friend, and you're a male. But there's also a female connotation also on that. Yeah, and you call somebody else, but traditionally that was the word. There's just like a welcome name.
It was sort of men to men.
Men to men, yeah.
To is sort of like Mr. almost.
Mr. It's like a Mr.
Yeah.
So it's a term of address,
That's
Tolai,
right. That's
and
what,
that's what
that's right.
your
So,
And it came about, as far as I understand, Stephen, correct me if this is wrong, but through non-Tolai indigenous people hearing Tolai people use the name, it's like bras or brother.
Yeah, brother.
Yeah.
It's like lay, friend.
Yeah.
And then they would refer to the Gunantuna speakers as Tolai.
Yes.
Okay.
So culturally we are known as Gunantuna,
Yeah.
and it's really the real people of the land. That's kind of Gunantuna what it means. But Tolai is just like, the welcoming, the identification. Just say when you are Tolai, you relate to that person. Whereas if you are an outsider, you're a Waira, they call them. But you cannot call everybody Tolais because it's our cultural identity, ethnic identity. Yeah. So that's the where Tolai came from.
And so I was thinking that if there's a term, then there's the perception of a group.
Yeah.
But before the 1920s, so from the 1870s to that period, you've got this period where the people all speak dialects of the same language, but they're not united. They're not unified. Because they're spread. They're quite spread over quite a large area.
All right. Well, coming back to the music, as an ethnic Tolai person, I was well educated and more knowledgeable now than before I looked at your collections. So I know music, as I see from the collections, cover the range from traditional music to the chorals introduced by the missionaries to contemporary, the string bands that came into contemporary. I'm just wondering whether your conclusions on the development of music, especially from the Tolai people, not with the influence from the mixed race community, but from Tolais, what do you see the musical background that evolved to what it is today as a Tolai? Just trying to look back at the musical developments with my people.
So, I think that one of the ways that people interact with each other is through imitation. And if you don't speak the same language, so if outsiders come into your presence, one of the things that frequently happens is that eventually you'll share a song. Because on the premise that all people appreciate music somehow. And so there's among the Tolai and among coastal and island Melanesians in general, there's intense curiosity over songs. And this is because of their the power that songs possess, not just the song itself, but the singing of the song, and because in the Tolai cosmology, there's a strong association between magical power and spells and songs. And so when outsiders such as the missionaries first arrive and start singing songs, there's intense curiosity about those songs. And also that there's been a lot of research done on this, but Melanesian people in general are collectors of other people's songs. And they absorb into their repertoires any songs that they'll come across, if they like them, and for various reasons. But so I discovered that there was, first of all, great curiosity over hymns. And I think that general sort of principle about curiosity about different kinds of music among the Tolai applied to other forms of music that they encountered as well. So I think that there's this sort of modernizing impulse that was at work as well. For example, we maybe will talk about Blasius Tohunga. I think he was around 14 during World War II, and he was a domestic servant for a Japanese officer. And he said that the Japanese officer used to play records in his house. And so he memorized some of the tunes, and he memorized the sound of the words. So he didn't know what the language was, but he could mimic back the words. And so he played me one of the songs that he more or less set to guitar that he remembered from that period. And I gave it to a Japanese man that I encountered. He took it back to Japan. He was able to find out what the song was. It was a song about a hospital ship. So it was a sort of a war ballad of bravery and valor and so forth. And he could go from Blasius Tohunga's transliteration back into Japanese, and then he translated into English for me and said his song. So you found that people would absorb songs like that. And Blasius is a very interesting guy himself. When a German priest called Father Reichel turned up I think it was in the 1930s, Blasius studied 4-part harmony writing under him and learned how to compose in 4-part, like in strict sort of choral or chorale kind of writing with him. So you found, I think he was originally from Toma.
Yeah.
But when I met him, he was in Nodu, close to Rabaul.
Correct.
He married someone from there, I think.
Yes.
So right throughout the 20th century, I found all of these little paths that would diverge and converge and so forth. And so what did I discover? I mean, really, I suppose, in a nutshell, a very rich and diverse history, musical history. And the interesting thing is that the Tolai people didn't abandon certain practices. They just kept adding new things to what they already had. It wasn't like, oh, we'll move to hymns or we'll move to guitar music. It's like, we've already got our own music. Now we'll just keep adding new genres and new repertoires and broaden and enrich those repertoires.
Amazing. And Stephen, for you, like if you're talking about Michael talking about the identity, like Tolai identity that can be expressed through music and actually shaped through music. When you're listening to this collection, what have you gained from it? What do you think you've learnt?
Well, I will speak as an indigenous of the area. I feel so connected and it answers a lot of questions that I had gaps in my understanding. Everybody learned about Blasius Tohunga and everybody knows personalities and musicians and artists out there, but this collection alone has actually, put me down to the roots of and a bit of pride in my own people and what how far they've come, because traditionally this was introduced music that has blended to traditional music that we've been able to capture and evolve with, and I feel really part of this journey. Actually, every musician that you interviewed had a story and how it's connected, and I just easily relate even down to the traditional tenor voice, to the different types of traditional songs. And contemporary now, rock bands are playing those songs. You know, the warbads, they expressing the same thing but in modern instruments these days. So I really feel so connected through Michael's work and the archive now. And I'll just put a question back to Michael here. That I know you did this research in the early 1990s or 1993. Then we had the volcanic eruption in 1994. So obviously there's some logistical or some issues of probably relating this information back. But I would like to also play a part in connecting back into the community as an archivist and as a researcher, and also with the rich collection that you have. I just feel that it needs to go back to the community. So I was thinking what has gone back with the work that you've done.
Well, so it's 25 years ago, essentially 26 that we're talking about. So a copy of my thesis went to back to the provincial government, who deposited it in the town library, which no longer exists.
Oh.
In fact, like in 1994, it was destroyed.
Destroyed. The town was destroyed.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So in essence, hardly anyone back in the Gazelle Peninsula will know much of this information. I mean, I've learned so much more since then as well, actually. There's many stories. I didn't even touch on brass band music. So we talked about choral music, I talked about guitar, I talked about... I haven't yet mentioned Abot, which was an early sort of popular song form. I think actually originates from New Ireland.
Yes, it's New Ireland.
But comes into the Tolai realm as well. And that was Garmut accompanied.
Yeah.
And it's one of the only genres that male and females perform together.
Sorry, when is Garmut?
Garmut is a slit drum, log slit drum.
Yeah.
And the Tolai have and New Islanders actually have a unique way of playing the slit drum, the garmut, which is by jolting the stick, letting it bounce on the drum rather than hitting it with actual sort of drumsticks. They have a single rod, a bit like a paddle handle, and then having it bounce rhythmically on the drum in a sort of this where you get the kind of triplet rhythm as well.
And is that distinctly Tolai? Is that?
This New Ireland and us, we play that way. The other parts of
I don't think anyone else
they don't do that. They beat it.
Yeah.
Whereas for us,
and garmut actually is a Tokpisin word for a type of wood, a type of tree.
That's right.
Which the drum's made from, which is a Kwanua language or Gunatuna language word, which comes into Pidgin actually.
Well, that's the history of the Tokpisin. Actually, it evolved around the Tola language. So a lot of words that are in Tokpisin actually as some
come from Stephen's language.
Yeah, that's why it's easier to relate to Tokpisin because.
So we're partly Samoan plantation.
Yes,
they also call it Samoan plantation pidgin, and so the Germans had plantations there, and also in the Gazelle area and Duke of York's area. So workers were circulating there, but so much of none of the recordings. Well, I shouldn't say that. A copy of the thesis was also lodged in the library of the Institute of Papua New Guinea Studies, but the recordings aren't. So for a long time, the recordings languished in my home. I changed continents a few times and jobs a few times, and I've published minimal on this research actually, and I've made some attempts at writing towards publication for some of the information, but other things have come up and got in the way, and I've switched sort of areas of research as well, not away from Melanesia, but a different focus. So I think it is time for some of this. It's a good time now, a quarter of a century later.
Yeah.
Particularly when many of the people that I've interviewed are no longer alive.
Yeah, but that's what I was kind of trying to allude to, that a lot of people I know have kind of moved on, but I want other siblings or the generations to be aware of what came out of the people and the culture to go back for them to embrace, and it's also a learning process like what I did through the collections.
And now it's in digital form. It is possible to take it back more safely as well, I guess. Do you have plans? Are you talking about this?
No, haven't really talked much about doing anything in particular with the recordings, although that'd be a great idea to collaborate on putting some of the material together in a form that's accessible for Tole readers. And so that's waiting collaboration with Stephen if he agrees, and we could.
I'm just keen, so let's work on a collaboration on that.
Because I think it's time to.
I just want to ask you, Stephen. Your role here is in the archive, and yet you also, with this collection in particular, have a role as it's from your community. Like, how does that feel for you to be in these kind of two positions, or how do you see your role with a collection like this?
Well, for me, the experience or the journey that I've gone through, just the time I've been as an archivist, and placing me where I belong, and the sense of connection and belonging in the music, because we pride ourselves out of expression through music, song and dance, and that's really drove home the personal experience, as well as from a community level, being a community leader here. I, as much as possible, try to, bring them into, the academic research sphere or professional sphere or social sphere, to get people to understand, how they relate to the bigger world. I mean, it's a global village now, and we got to be part of that. So, as a community person, as an archivist, very enlightening and enriching for me personally. But I think I don't lose sight of the community that I represent. I just felt so satisfied that I'm part of this, and all we need is to connect back and loop it back into the community at that. Thank you, Michael Webb, for joining us on Toksave Culture Talks and sharing your amazing recordings and knowledge connecting my Tolai culture and heritage.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us. If you would like to listen to Michael's recordings, they are available as the MW6 collection in our online catalogue. For access and more information about Paradisec, you can visit our website at www.paradisec.org.au.
Toksave Culture Talks was launched as part of the United Nations International Year of Indigenous Languages in 2019.
We would like to acknowledge the support of the University of Sydney's Chancellor's Committee for the digitisation of Michael Webb's collection. We would also like to acknowledge the support of the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language, and the University of Sydney, the University of Melbourne, and the Australian National University.